Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats.
Good morning, everybody. Good morning. Welcome back, everybody. Please take your seats. We're going to start. It is working. I think it's just a really vocal, energised crowd today. Welcome back, everybody. Welcome to everyone in the room, to all the people who are joining us online as well. Before we get stuck into this fantastic panel session that we have for you all, Powerful Women have just asked me just to just give a little bit of information on about the protest that happened at the beginning of the event today. And Powerful Women would just like me to let you all know that the people involved were offered direct dialogue with Powerful Women in advance of the event, which was declined, unfortunately, and also they wouldn't provide any details of the group, so kind of follow-up is actually quite difficult. But we are going to move on, and we've got a fantastic agenda for you today. I hope you're all feeling energised. I hope you've got lots of questions to ask the panel today. My name is Abby Sampson. I'm Chief Corporate Affairs Officer at SGN, and we're really proud to be the strategic partner for this conference today. I think at a time in DEI where we're all looking for good news and green shoots and reasons to be cheerful, I'm really pleased that Powerful Women recognise SGN as 6th out of the top 100 energy companies for women in leadership positions. And leadership is absolutely what we're going to get into in the panel session today. Before I ask our panel to introduce themselves, just to remind everyone in the room and online that we will have an interactive Q&A session as part of our panel discussion this morning. So please, you can use the Slido code, and also we'll have roving mics in the room. So please do start thinking about things you'd like to ask the esteemed panel here today. So without further ado, I'm going to open up to the panel. Could I please ask you all to introduce yourself, and could you tell us why diversity and inclusion is important to you? Start with you, Joanna.
Perfect, thank you so much. So my name is Joanna Alnion. I'm the Chief Impact Officer at an organisation called Whittle and Diversity in Retail. Inclusion is really important to me. It's always been part of my career. I've been in different roles, different sectors, different types of organisation. I've always been part of the agenda, particularly for women, but also it's really personal to me now because I'm the mum of an autistic son. And I don't think you really understand inclusion until you've been excluded. So that drives my personal passion as well.
Amazing, thank you.
Hi, I'm Gamil Yafai. I'm a diversity and inclusion strategist. I have been for the last 25 years. I spent 9 years heading up diversity practices for marketing, branding, recruitment, advertising organisations before setting up Diversity Marketplace in 2005. As we work globally, we're in so many different countries, focusing on diversity and inclusion purely. However, the last 2 years, what we found is sectors coming forward, looking at how we can collaborate, looking at, so sectors like retail, and I'll tell you more about that a bit later on, horticulture, landscapers, gardeners, recognising the importance of diversity for their futures, the rail industry, working with 20 rail operators, and there are so many more. But diversity and equity and inclusion is important for me, partially because, one, I'm mixed race, growing up part Christian, part Muslim, and also I have a son who has autism, dyspraxia, and ADHD, and I'm dyslexic. But to me, it's who I am more than anything else.
Morning, everyone. Delighted to be here. I'm Senda Kavindele. I'm the Head of Inclusion, Diversity and Equity at KPMG. In terms of why this is really important to me, I'm a mother of 2 girls who happen to be women, as myself, who are black. And just having experienced some of these challenges in corporate Britain of underrepresentation and being in a minority, it's really, really important to me to be able to drive meaningful difference in an organisation where we can actually engender equity and inclusion across all underrepresented groups. So delighted to be here. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Dan McGrail. I'm the Chief Exec of Great British Energy. And I suppose from a professional point of view, I'm setting up a publicly owned energy company. And I know it can be often a cliche, but I think with the fact that this is a publicly owned energy company, it is so important that it is representative of the communities that it is serving. From a personal perspective, look, and you know, I started my career as a director, I'd say 2012, and I walked into a management team which is exactly the antithesis of the management teams and leadership groups that we're trying to promote through Powerful Women. And I can honestly say I didn't look forward to those meetings. They were often unpleasant, toxic, difficult environments to be around. And as a leader, I've spent time trying to create, and as I've grown in my career, I have the opportunity to build teams which are more representative of my own vision of what a team should look like. And I can honestly say it's much more impactful, it's more fun, and it's more enjoyable work in an environment where you are able to create high trust, able to create complementary personalities that really create cohesion within a group. And you get more done when that's the truth. So, you know, I honestly think not only is this the right mission, it's also the most effective way forward for business and industry.
Thank you. And we're going to come on to some of those sort of barriers and blockers and how leaders can seek to overcome them in the conversation this morning. I've got some individual questions for the panel and then some to open up to the whole panel. But Dan, if I could actually stay with you. Congratulations on your permanent appointment as CEO of Great British Energy. I'm really delighted that Great British Energy is part of the Powerful Women Leaders Coalition. Obviously, you have the opportunity as a CEO of a new business, as you say, publicly owned, to really embed D&I right from the outset. So how can you kind of seize that opportunity?
Well, I mean, you're right. It is a privilege actually to create. I mean, this is you know, as I say, it's a publicly owned company. So the first privilege is that, you know, we're starting something with most startups have to be quite scrappy and work from day to day and hand to mouth, whereas we're starting with a very solid capitalization, and we can start to make choices very much from the beginning about how we want the company to be and how we want it to evolve. So the way I kind of put it is we're building inclusion into the architecture of the company rather than into the sort of the design, because the design you can change from day to day, but if we build it into the architecture, then it will stick. And already we're tipping on for about 100 people now, so I mean, you're still relatively early. The bill only passed in May, so we're starting to scale up. And we are 50-50 in terms of gender distribution and importantly also in the leadership roles, which is really positive. But it's as we evolve and as we sort of move towards creating our Aberdeen headquarters, I think we'll face some challenges in terms of different demographics in parts of the workforce. One of the things that we've done from the beginning is, and our strategic plan will be published at end of the month, beginning of December. It might get sort of triaged with the budget and all of that kind of stuff. But the value statement in that document is one of the things we've done is we've co-created that with the team, and I think maybe if I'd have written it, it might have been different. But I kind of took the conscious decision to take the hands off, and we brought the team together and said, right, this is an opportunity to have fingerprints on that architecture and on that design. So really sort of bedding that in from the beginning. The second thing is, it's a kind of quasi-governmental position at the moment. So we're building an organisation which is, I'm a private sector thinker. I come from, my career has been in the private sector, but we're also bringing together a good degree of civil servants. And I don't want to other any kind of mentality. There's no right or wrong way in that. And the way that we're talking about it is we need to create like a best of both worlds approach to sort of building the culture of the organisation. So yes, on enterprising, yes, innovative, but also high levels of integrity and responsibility, and thinking about that from the get-go. And the final point I'd make is that we hold a position of influence because GB Energy will invest in projects in many respects which are, maybe struggling to get over the line or emerging technologies. And as we use that position of influence and that public money in those projects, it's important that we exercise that to make sure that we're not just delivering returns in projects, but we're actually delivering societal impacts and outcomes that go broader than just, is this clean energy megawatts? What are we doing for building local supply chains? What are we doing about community impact? How are we working with apprentices? You know, all of this kind of wider thinking. So really building this kind of total inclusion across multiple characteristics from the beginning.
Thank you. Camille, I'm going to come to you next. I feel terrible. I've gone to the men first, which feels like completely wrong. It's alphabetical, just in case you're checking. Camille, so Diversity Marketplace has got a heritage over 20 years plus working with leaders internationally on how to increase diversity and inclusion in workplaces. Tell us a bit about how you're finding leaders navigating the sort of geopolitical turbulence that we find ourselves in at the moment, and has your work kind of changed over the last 12 months?
Well, firstly, thank you for inviting me to be part of this panel. You know, this has been the most interesting year that I've experienced in my 25 years of doing this. And I would actually say that what started with Trump has accelerated into most organizations that I work with starting to reframe how they think about diversity, equity, and inclusion. You know, is it just moving up a diversity matrix, or is it focused on impact? And are we really monitoring, measuring, and managing, you know, diversity, equity, and inclusion? If I was to ask the audience, you know, the question, how many of your women are likely to leave over the next 6 months? Would you be able to tell me? That's a question to you. No? Well, you should be able to. And that's the thing, that's the focus that we're now shifting towards. Not just matrix, but leadership. And when I say leadership, I'm talking about chief execs, boards all the way down. And we've seen masses of change this year. We've seen organizations that have shifted from just having a head of diversity and a diversity corporate strategy to senior leaders in organizations recognizing that they need to become more competent in their confidence in driving diversity, equity, and inclusive practices into their departments. Forget about the organization. I'm not saying heads of diversities are now dead, because you still have a huge, huge role to play in terms of facilitating this to happen. But we need to be more intentional. We need to be more focused. I was privileged to chair a CEO roundtable in Milan in October with chief execs of over 50 retail organizations, from Mars, Coca-Cola, Procter & Gamble, Nestle, you know, just a massive room. The conference had 700 attendees, and we had 3 hours with chief execs to really try and dig a little bit deeper, because even in 3 hours you can't achieve masses, but to look at where the resistance was, but also to look at how we can accelerate diversity, equity, and inclusion. More importantly, how they can accelerate through their own actions and behaviors. 70% of change that needs to happen will come from those senior leaders, because if they're the ones that are role modeling the right behaviors, then that will feed downwards, and we need that to happen.
Perfect, thank you. We're going to be picking up on where you started on the data point with Sendo in a moment. But Joanna, if I could come to you. Obviously you've worked in other sectors, your experience across hospitality, travel and retail. What are the lessons that people here in the energy sector can learn from what leaders are doing well in other sectors?
Sure, thank you. So just to explain a little bit at what Whittle and Diversity in Retail do, similar in some sense to Powerful Women, we bring organisations together from across the industry. We work with 115 organisations across that, from one single sites to the Sainsbury's and Tesco's of this world, the Hiltons. And a little note to the sector as well, because the hospitality, travel, leisure sector and retail, the difference being, I think, particularly to this sector, is you have a very, very large front line. which are generally minimum wage employees. And I think that's driven a lot of change, ironically, because when you have a population like that, you really have to think about talent, because all of those sectors can transfer so easily between the different areas. So you have to really think about engagement strategies for your people that won't lure them to go for an extra 50p at the restaurant next door, which, and I'm being simplistic, but it's thinking about those different areas. So the industry has changed night and day to when I joined it about 20 years ago. It still is on a journey, absolutely. And I'll give you an example. So hospitality has one of the lowest gender pay gaps in all sectors. In every sector, hospitality has one of the lowest. So there's been a huge amount of work, but the journey is still there, because the challenge in that sector is that you have a 50-50 split of men and women at the front line, very much, and that diversity just falls off, like many organisations. But when you have 50-50, it isn't like I would imagine the challenge of this sector, where it's perhaps more difficult to attract women. That's a real issue. So there's still a lot of work, so within that context. And we have an inclusion maturity curve where all of our members and beyond, every year we do a benchmarking exercise. So I thought it would be just useful to share with you what is it that the organisations that are at the most mature point, so in our curve, what are they doing? Because we've done that holistically and we've worked with AlixPartners, the global consultancy, to look at that. And there are 5 key areas. Number 1 is not a surprise, it's leadership. But essentially the leadership goes top to bottom to middle. And the middle, which is always, we know, some of the challenge, is absolutely engaged. And through our research, and we can see that those organisations, to your point about impact, those organisations where leaders are champions of this, not just from the CEO, but all the way through, there is an average revenue growth that's much higher than the companies that are at the bottom of that curve. Those organisations who decrease their gender pay gap, on average, within our data set, have a 5% average revenue difference to those who do not. And it's those conversations with leaders that really can make the difference. So it becomes part of the DNA. They see the business case. They see that this work is intrinsic to a strategic pillar. And that really does make a huge difference. The second is intersectionality. So looking and making sure that we're not just looking at one homogenous group. When we think of, we all have different backgrounds, we all have different things. It cannot be a homogenous approach as well. Data, I know we're going to touch on, but all I can say, for example, is those organisations that do this well go deep. They really do, and they understand where they can put limited resource to have the biggest impact. And they go even deeper. So Co-op Group, if you're aware of them, they do a pay gap report. They don't just do a gender pay gap report. They do an ethnicity pay gap report. They do a disability pay gap report. And they do a socioeconomic background pay gap report. And they are creating things. So they really, and they're one of our most progressive organisations as well. And the fourth is flexibility and support. It's not a surprise in terms of, we talked about returnships and that whole area. The organisations doing this well really look at how they can support all of their carers, all of their parents within their organisation. So Sodexo, if you know Sodexo, are a contract catering organisation, global. In the UK, they have equalised parental leave for 18 weeks. Any employee can have 18 weeks parental leave. These are the kind of things, the bold actions we talked about earlier before, which really drive that. And the last one is that talent acceleration. Have bold ambitions, put structured interventions in place, returnships, sponsorship more than mentorship, because research shows that has more of an impact as well, and really making sure that the policies are there to support women. 5 years ago, no one ever talked about menopause. Now, the organisations we work with, policy structures, fertility, pregnancy, have the surrounding and the support structure for the moments that matter for people in their careers. That blanket makes a big difference. So those, I hope, are helpful. Those were the 5 key things that came from our research.
They're very helpful indeed. I've been scribbling down the 5 and hoping that my menopause brain won't let me down. But Senda, can I come on to you and let's kind of get to this data point, because I think probably everyone in the room actually recognises how important data is, but what do we do with it and how can leaders really leverage the data that probably exists within organisations, and then how do we couple that with a sort of more cultural piece of work that often needs to be done in tandem?
Just picking up on your question earlier about how many people know how many women are going to leave their organisation in the next 6 months, we do, because we track, monitor and measure. And conversely, we also know how many women are going to progress their careers.
There you go.
Not only in the next 6 months, but we actually have that much more longer term sustained focus on this particular area. We also, like Co-op, track all our pay gaps through all the different pillars, recognising the intersectionality that exists across the different pillars. But I think it's important to share that the data story is absolutely critical and fundamental for long-term business success. And you have to interweave it with a whole cultural change or cultural program within your organisation, because without that, the culture doesn't thrive. And in terms of just thinking about the data story, it's first about setting that baseline and then having those targets to enable you to really identify those gaps in your organization, where the underrepresentation may exist, and also set some practical steps and interventions to help you address those particular challenges. And that is also recognizing what your ambitions are. So we, for example, at KPMG have set our targets to 2030. We know where we want to be from an underrepresentation perspective. We know how many women we want to have in the business. We're not far off from those targets, but we do have challenges across some of the other underrepresented areas. And these are all published on our annual review on an annual basis, and the next publication will be in January. So we're really, really focused with intentionality. Then there's a piece around identifying the root cause. Why is it that there are these data gaps? Why do they exist? Where are the hotspots to uncover any of these systemic issues that exist in your organization? And then with that, sort of bringing in the relevant interventions to help you to manage those hotspots and identify those areas, and also adding those resources to help you have the greatest impact. We've talked about impact earlier, and it's fundamental that you apply those resources to those particular areas. Then there is the monitoring the progress, regularly reviewing it on an annual basis, or even far more frequently, but more importantly to the leadership story that we've just been focused on. Inclusive leadership is fundamental. And if you have the data, you can then hold your leaders to account to be able to be personally accountable and committed to those actions that will drive progress in your organization. And we do that through, for example, our scorecard. So really embedding IDE metrics into a leadership scorecard and fundamentally interweaving it through to the cultural piece. I missed the second part of your question.
It was your point about that interweaving of the cultural and data. So I think you've absolutely answered that there. Thank you so much. I've got some panels now, some questions now for the whole panel, and I'd like to start off with, as we heard kind of Monica saying earlier on today, we Powerful Women really want today to be very practical, advice-based, so people can go back into their businesses with buzzing with ideas, but practical things that they can kind of implement. So what advice would you all give to leaders in terms of how they can help create a diverse organisation? And I think when we think about leaders, I think if we think about it in the sort of broadest terms, because I think also there's a really important role for line managers as a leader of a team and of people. So I think maybe Camille, if I could start with you.
Yeah. Well, I talked earlier about the fact that more and more organisations are starting to focus on, creating departmental action plans and having heads of departments becoming accountable and all of their staff becoming responsible for driving diversity, equity and inclusion. And part of that is about those leaders understanding the business case, not for the organisation, but specifically for their department. What is the business case for getting comms right? What's the business case for getting procurement right? What's the business case, or the DEI business case, for HR. Every department has its own business case, but I've never heard a department talk about the business case for diversity to their department. It's always been the whole organisation. And if we keep going to that corporate strategy, we will never progress. It's taken, I've seen so many changes over the last 25 years, but none of them have had an accelerated progress in this area. And I see that as partially something I call initiativitis. Mm-hmm. We move from project to project, we follow others that we believe are driving diversity because we think they're doing well, but we forget about our own culture within our own organisation. And that's what we need to focus on. And we talked about stats. To me, it's not just about having statistics. It's not just about having, and this is one of the sad things that that I hear, where not from organisations but from staff working in those organisations, that staff surveys, yeah, they're great. Are they? Pulse surveys, great. So the great comes from the leaders in the organisations. The staff say, no, they're not great. Nobody does anything with the data, or very few organisations do anything with the data. They want to go deeper. And I'll talk more about that in a moment.
Excellent. Dan, maybe if I could come to you. Any hints and tips?
A couple of experiences and maybe a sort of a philosophy that I'd share. The two experiences, and I'm going to go back to my previous role. I was formerly the Chief Executive of Renewable UK, which is a trade association representing principally the wind industry. And I think, and this isn't to be critical of anybody, but I think there was a point where we observed that the leadership firepower in the industry was not necessarily developing at the pace that the industry was. So, there was a group of well-known, well-recognised industry leaders, but the pipeline behind that wasn't coming forward, and that group sort of ended up was the board of our association, and that kind of meant that there was a degree of groupthink. It was a certain profile, and whilst there was decent diversity, it was not brilliant. It was decent. It was kind of an echo chamber. You came together as a board. You did that. So we created something called a shadow board, which was effectively, you had to apply for it. You had to be not in an existing leadership position. You had to have the support of your organisation and be seen as an emerging leader with the ambition to develop. And we blind selected that board. So there was, and actually because of the gender profile in the wind industry, we actually were concerned that it'd end up being quite male dominated. And it turned out we did 3 different cohorts of the shadow board over 5 years, and through the blind selection, the gender diversity was excellent, and actually across multiple characteristics, the diversity of the shadow board was good, and those members of the shadow board would come to board meetings and challenge the decisions that we were making as a board, and bringing that alternative perspective from the emerging leader, maybe a bit younger, but maybe seeing things from a different perspective. They would always see the decisions that were coming to boards before the main board. And I know of a number of organisations who've taken this and emulated it within their organisations to increase the challenge to that potential groupthink that you get. The second thing I did was I worked really hard on building this team in kind of like the sort of the inclusive sort of perspective that I wanted, and we accomplished that. There was 67% of the staff were female. The leadership was 2/3 female. There was good distribution across nationality, ethnicity, multiple different languages. But I remember looking at the team one day and realising we'd had this speaker come and talk to us about how we communicate the message of net zero to people in the street. And they gave us a statistic that 86% of people in Britain live within 8 miles of where they were born. And we are probably in the in the 14% of people who go around and move and pick up different experiences. And the other thing they said was, the average household income is £687 a week. So you want to talk to them about net zero and buying an electric car and having a heat pump and all of this stuff. But, these are the challenges. And it occurred to me that my team were, well educated, pretty middle class, and we needed to do more on socioeconomic background. And so I think the thing I would say from a leadership perspective is don't be one-dimensional in your approach to this. Consistently think about how you're measuring your organization's development across multiple areas. And we formed a partnership with the Social Mobility Foundation, brought some interns. Both of those interns became permanent employees. And now I think that exclusion that you can do through the hiring process of saying must be university educated has now dropped off the agenda, and that improves the funnel. And the philosophy point I would make, just finally, just something that I believe quite strongly in, and I try to bring in general, is to hire teams, not to hire people, or not to hire roles. I think there's often a kind of write the perfect job description and hire the person ticking off the job description. I really think about the person that I want in the team and how they will fit within the dynamic of my team. And I'd rather compromise on skills and experience and build them up than compromise on the person type or the personality that they bring, because there's nothing like that cohesion, as I said earlier. There's nothing like it, because it just makes your team move at much more at speed, and it makes it frankly makes it more enjoyable working with people who get on as a group. But if you bring in like a homogenous type, then you end up clashing. So for me, hire teams rather than people. And I think you see that play out in sport as well. If teams really are complementary, they're more successful.
Brilliant, thank you. And I think the light show is also just to make sure that everyone is paying attention, and you're all thinking you're all thinking about the questions that we're gonna you're all going to be asking in a moment. But actually, Dan, to your point there about intersectionality, it's exactly the point you were touching on there. And I think your reflections about those 5 kind of key principles or areas that are in the most kind of mature areas, as you mentioned. Any other sort of advice or tips you'd wish to impart?
I think they're quite simplistic, I have to say, which is always
Simple
good.
Is always good.
Simple is always good. And I think it's about really understanding impact, but it's action. And I think words can be very, but what are the actions that are happening? The role of the CEO can just not be understated, as we know. And how that culture proliferates through the organisation. And I think it always is, you can have lots of interventions, lots of projects, lots of different things. But fundamentally, the success of this agenda is what is the confidence and capability of leaders in this space. And I think generally the confidence and capability isn't very high. And it's how do you do that in a meaningful way that isn't just e-learning, where I tap through where I have a conversation. There are great interventions like reverse mentoring. They can have pros and cons, but it's doing it with care. So I think really thinking about how as organisations can you really build confidence and capability where conversations can happen, really good conversations, because that's where you move through and really understand. And I think you can have all the conversations, but then you have to act. And the only other thing I would really say is tell the stories. Tell the stories. There is so much diversity, so much lived experience in so many different, the people around the C-suite table will have so much of that, even if they do appear to be a homogenous group at the moment. Allow vulnerability, create that space that people can tell those stories. And my last thing is really do a sense check in your organisation if you have brilliant jerk syndrome. So you can have all of the philosophy, all of the tick boxes, all of the values. But if you have that best salesman, that best operator, that best engineer who is allowed to behave as they've always behaved because that's just them, or that's your brilliant jerk. And if you have brilliant jerk syndrome, all of the other work, if that behaviour is not called out, everything else falls down. So
You can tell from the sniggers that everyone's thinking about that person
Brilliant,
now.
Jack.
Yeah. Someone has come to mind.
Yeah.
And to sort of, you all are. And actually, just to kind of abuse the privilege of chair, actually, but to kind of come in on your point about conversations, I think it's about, particularly for senior leaders, getting uncomfortable with some of those conversations. And I think sometimes people don't have those conversations, they feel a bit awkward or don't know how to approach something, so it's sort of pushed to one side or delayed, and actually it's going to those difficult things first and having those kind of difficult, uncomfortable conversations.
It's giving them confidence, and confidence to say, I don't know.
Yeah.
Because as leaders, we're paid for our decision making. And for leaders to say, I don't know, you have to build that confidence in.
Confidence. Senda, any advice that you would like to share?
Well, all the thunder's been stolen
Oh,
here. But if I just want to pick up on your point about that leadership competence piece and actually the storytelling, which comes to mind, we found, as an example, where that has had one of the greatest impacts in our business. If I link it back to the data story and anchor onto that point, that is how you end up driving your declaration in your organization through those campaigns, as a result of those leadership storytelling pieces, and then you can really understand what is happening beneath the bonnet in terms of your workforce composition. It's not only, again, about the representation, but of course there are other elements such as the inclusivity, which you've touched on previously, and those equitable measures, moving away from the tokenism approach, but really having that leadership buy-in and accountability to drive change. And also thinking about IDE more as a business, a strategic business imperative, moving it away from the HR story, but sort of trickling it down from ExCo, CEO level, board level, but right through the business, recognizing that we're all leaders and we can all be change makers. As long as we move with intentionality, we have the data, we have the actions from the colleague sentiment that you talked to, but actually acting upon that, and not just having standalone programs in organizations, but really embedding it and red threading it through your organization with intentionality.
I promise I will not come to you last on the next question. I'd like to sort of move us on to thinking about jobs and skills, and specifically in the energy sector and the point in the transition that we're at the moment, which is obviously a crucial one. We're often talking about the ageing workforce or the skills gap, and I think Powerful Women themselves have identified this 400,000 new roles that are needed by 2050 to actually deliver the transition. So I think if I'd start with you, Dan, if I may, how do we actually use this as an opportunity to increase the diversity in the sector as opposed to something that could be a threat?
Yeah, I'm going to start with a kind of specific example coming from my own sort of industry of offshore wind. And I think that basically the workforce needs to roughly double between now and 2030, according to the latest statistics. So it's about 50,000 people. But when you look at under the bonnet of the data, and we talk a lot about making the industry attractive to school leavers or apprentices, which is important. But when you look at the actual data, about 65% of the roles in the industry that need to be recruited are at MVQ5 or above. So those people are already in the workforce. So the question then is not how do you, it's not only how do you attract people out of school, and I think there's a job on us on that, but I think, and I'll come back to that, but there's something about making the energy industry attractive amongst all industries, about learning some of the lessons we've been hearing about from retail, from hospitality, because actually, one of the obstacles is that there is an impression that engineering is an industry which is not really well understood. And this is the second point I want to make. It's about sort of demystifying engineering or technical careers. I used to work for a German company, and being an engineer in Germany is like being a doctor or a lawyer. It's seen as a pillar of society type role, and I personally think that that's the case. I'm not an engineer, but I've worked in engineering my entire career, and I think we don't use our own language well enough here, which is that we often say,
you know, my dishwasher's broken, I need to call an engineer. And you know, that's a technician, and it's a noble career. There's nothing wrong with it, but we should really value the technical careers. I ran a company in Spain, and the language of the word engineer and the word technician is very distinct, and it has different connotations. And we need to also promote that distinction, that engineering is that kind of deeply change-making, impactful career, which is about leadership, and really sort of sell that story. Because I mean, and I bring this to home. When I talk to my daughter, who's 12 next month, she loves maths. She's brilliant at it. She loves science. She's just gone to secondary school. She's blown away by science. She's absolutely loving it. I say engineer to her, and she's like, I don't know about that. Mm-hmm. You know? And it's like, I really want you to be passionate about, as passionate about this as I am. And I think we need to get a bit of that into it.
Yeah. I think there's probably also something about who are our message carriers as well as the story, isn't it? Because I think, you know, we've heard all the data before about, you know, the lack of women and well, diversity in general at sort of CEO and board level. And if they're the people who are sort of out there, you know, then that's actually, you know, just kind of reinforcing this is what the sector looks like. And this is, so I think actually that's showcasing different roles as well. And as you say, to demystify them and show a light on them is really important, isn't it? I can see you, Gamil, you're keen to come in.
No, I'm just sort of jumping off the back of Dan. And you see, for me, and it's just something I picked up on what you said, you know, for everybody here, your people are your biggest advocates. You know, but are we making the most of our people? You know, we talked a lot about leadership earlier. But one thing that we've experienced, we run, you know, positive action programs, particularly for women. And we have done for the last 15 years, for, I'd say 13 of those within the civil service, for the last 2 years, working with the Great British Rail Transition Team on how we develop women, you know, within the rail industry. And by developing, you know, we're talking about something similar to what we were talking about earlier, increasing the confidence in the competence of women to actually manage their own career journeys. And I'm trying to think of a question I can ask you. You know, how many of you here believe that you bring, let's say, 80% of your best self to work? How many of you? Hands up if you know, if you bring more than 80% of your best self to work.
I'm going to put my hand.
Okay. I would say that was half the room. So, you know, half the room, 80% plus. What we find is that in our positive action programs, I mean, the one for civil service is called Beyond Boundaries, and it's literally about helping women within organisations to manage their careers better. And by managing their careers better, I'm talking about getting them to feel confident to take ownership of their careers and to start, you know, not just looking for mentors, looking for sponsors, you know, identifying different networks to engage with. And what we found from those programs is that at least 50% of the women on those programs get promoted within the 12 months that program runs. So if you want to increase, you know, quickly, you know, think about what you need to be doing as an organisation to support the individuals within your organisation. Because the more people that feel that they belong in your organisation, the more they're going to talk to other people about it and their kids and get their kids into schools talking about it.
I think you're going to have a queue of people after this of like, how can you help me manage my career? But thank you.
Can I just add a build on that? Yeah. I welcome that, absolutely welcome that. But I would add to that you need allies in the room. It's not just a women problem. Yeah. It's an institutional challenge.
Yep. But that's where you get that's the sponsorship. The sponsorship are the allies.
Agreed.
Yeah.
It's the
Just needed
systemically- yeah, I
needed to
agree,
share
yeah.
that.
No, absolutely. And I think we're going to come on in the next question to those sort of barriers and blockers to some of that, because I think sometimes that's all very well, but, I really want to do that, but how, there are barriers and things to kind of overcome. Joanna, is there anything you wanted to add on that point around that sort of how we address the sort of skills gaps and ageing workforce and how that might be different? I know you mentioned that sort of frontline element in retail.
The only thing I would add is, you can put as much in the top of the bucket as you want, but if everyone is coming out of the leaks in the side, and it's really, really understanding, as I mentioned before, using the data, where are people leaving? And what are the moments that matter in their career, in their time where they need extra support, extra encouragement, whatever that might be? And what is the systemic structure that can help to do that? Because otherwise you just have a leaky bucket and it will just never improve.
That's a very good point, very good point. Okay, let's think about those. Let's go on to the barriers and blockers. Camille, I might start with you. How do we overcome some of those kind of barriers within organisations that we all may bump up against?
Yeah. Well, I'm sure every single individual in this room believes that you are good, honest, decent human beings that wouldn't discriminate, alienate, exclude anybody. However, we still all have biases. We have blind spots. We don't know what we don't know. And even though there's been a decade of unconscious bias training that's happened, I'm not saying it's the training that doesn't work. It's what do people do with that training? How are they applying it? How are they accountable for anything when they get back into the offices? Or is that training gone? And I would say 95% of the time that training happens and nothing follows. It's the continuation. What else are we doing? How are we linking up everything? How are we linking up all of these different initiatives, from the mentorship, the sponsorship, the reverse mentorship, and everything else? How are we using that to create, whether it's KPIs or to create initiatives and to actually make sure that it does embed? That's the reason why we've not really progressed. I mean, we do global audits with organisations from Publicis Group, their own Saatchi & Saatchi, right through to the rail industry that we're doing masses with at the moment. And when we ask leaders the question, where do you think you are on a maturity matrix? We have a maturity matrix. We use a global diversity, equity, and inclusion benchmark, and there are 5 different levels. Most leaders believe that they are 4, 5. When they do the audit, you find out that they are 2 moving into 3, because most leaders believe they're doing much better than they think they are.
I think that just, again, to abuse my privilege
Please.
as chair, but just I think a really interesting point there. We've talked about making the business case and that sort of maturity audits. I think there's also something in a lot of our businesses, they're safety critical, and safety is absolutely embedded. So there will be those safety maturity scales. So that's the language that people already understand. So I think actually using that when we're talking about diversity and inclusion and kind of putting it through the same lens just gets buy-in in a different way.
I agree. And it comes back to Dan's point, health and safety, how critical is health and safety in any organisation? Diversity and inclusion needs to be just as critical.
Yeah, absolutely. Senda, can I come to you on the point about barriers and blockers that you may have encountered, or how we can seek to navigate them?
Yeah. I'll just build on your point. I think one of the critical pieces here, again, we referenced earlier, is that measurement of leadership accountability. Once you have that embedded in the scorecards, then it becomes just as imperative as any other strategic business plan that you want to embed in your organization. And also just thinking around the different elements or pillars of one strategy, it's about how do you even partner with organizations that can really help you have that compelling proposition to move forward on your agenda. Good example, I saw Vivian earlier in the room. Vivian? We work very closely with Vivian, obviously, who's chair of the FTSE Women Leaders Review. We've been co-sponsoring that with Lloyds Banking Group for many, many years now. And that's a very clear example where we have made significant shifts in terms of our representation and inclusion and equity measures for our women in our organisation. So it's that intentionality is what I would add to that. And I appreciate we've focused on that before, but it really is about measuring, embedding with intentionality, educating oneself as a leader to get comfortable with those uncomfortable areas of inclusion and equity.
Fantastic. Dan, I'm going to come to you on the blockers. This is your warning, everybody. We're coming to you for, not warning, invitation to come forward with your questions. So please, if you haven't, I'll come to those in the room and also via Slido. But I'm just going to take Dan and then Joanna on these barriers and blockers, if I may.
I'm going to use the opportunity to talk about barriers and blockers to talk about personal passion of mine, something I've got experience with, which is putting families at the heart of policy. My ex-wife, when she was in maternity leave with our second child, got an opportunity for a promotion, but in different schools. She was a teacher, and the schools happened to be on the wrong side of the border of a local education authority. So she went for the job, got it. I mean, the difference in distance was negligible, but it happened to be in a different jurisdiction. And then when she got it, they told her that she needed to pay the maternity pay back. I'm just like, surely that can't be right. I mean, it's a promotion. It's still working for the public sector. It's still the same. No. Anyway, it culminated in a county court summons, which we ended up paying, and just, and I remain a decade later fizzing about that. I just think it's absolutely extraordinarily wrong. And when I ran a company in Spain, families, I mean, you could argue families are much more at the heart of society in Spain anyway. It's a maybe different philosophy, but company and corporate policy was much more reflective of the fact that the reality that people live in family systems, not as individuals. And, so paternity leave was 16 weeks. And you could take it, you could slice it up. There were rules around it, fair rules to allow people to manage, but they were fair. And that, allowed, for a much more even distribution of the word burden was used before. It's definitely not the opportunity, frankly, that comes from the early days of a child's life. I just think there's so much mileage for us on this. And it goes beyond that. It's also things like, dealing with miscarriage, dealing with all of these things that people as families, as couples go through. And I honestly just think there's something we could keep building on, is not make policies designed around individuals, but make them designed around families.
Thank you. And Joanna, barriers and blockers.
I think a long-term barrier and blocker is really, what is the really true level of commitment within an organisation? So with all the geopolitical events that are happening, particularly in the UK, particularly for our sector, I think all sectors, budgets are tight. The reality is revenues are lower, margins are tighter, and where does an organisation stand, and how do they keep true to that commitment? And I think that is a barrier and a blocker, particularly now the narrative isn't, we heard from the Minister earlier, we have organisations that are putting in their 5-year plan if we get a Farage government. And the thing is that, there is conversations that perhaps are being had now that weren't being had 2-3 years ago, because now it's okay, or do I really have to do that anymore? And I think it's when the going gets tough, where is the real level of commitment within your organisation? And that's where it has to be in the DNA, and it has to be, if we don't have this, people will go. So we did a survey a year ago, and 65% of employees said if their organisation rode back on this work, they would consider going to a different organisation. The genie is out of the bottle, the work is there. So really, what is the level of commitment, and how do you get that into the DNA and core of the business?
Fantastic, thank you. Okay, I'm going to open to questions. I know we've already got one here, lots of hands. We're never going to get through all of this. And I've got the magic iPad for people at home, online, who've submitted questions. I'm going to come to the lady here who has the microphone. Can I ask you to please kind of give your name, where you're from as well, for the benefit for people who are listening online?
Hi, Suzanne Law from Scottish. and Southern Electricity Networks and Transmission. Gosh, I'm nervous. I'm really, really keen understanding about the data. I think it's great to hear, that you're looking into, broad aspects, and I think it's so important, especially to be looking at what affects women as a whole, what most negatively impacts us. Something that I've done quite a bit of work on is looking at domestic abuse. There was a really interesting research a few years ago, Vodafone and I believe KPMG, showing the impact on businesses, productivity, the impact on career progression for women. So that creates a huge barrier, and I think it's really important, and I'd be interested to hear your thoughts, really just how businesses look at implementing HR policies to ensure that there's really that raising of awareness across the business so that we make it everybody's business and not just the victim survivor. But I think really, again, reducing that stigma to enable there to be more women and have more opportunity in the workplace, I think is fantastic.
Great, thank you. I'm going to go to the panel. I'm not going to ask everyone to answer every question, or we'll never get through all of them, but is there anyone who'd like to directly respond on that point?
You're all looking at me, but I wasn't in my role at the time, but I'm really pleased to hear from a KPMG perspective that you said you saw that research. And that's one of the things, I guess, we specialise in, a lot of thought leadership around these different areas. But as you were sharing your question, I was considering how you embed at local level. And I think we touched on it earlier. So you have obviously leadership at the top with all those initiatives, but it's about localising it fundamentally into the specific business areas, having that leadership accountability that is interwoven into their scorecards, so that where they are sitting at the end of the financial year, being appraised for those activities, and really make sure that they understand their staff challenges at a personal level. They've got to have that level of accountability, that granularity of data.
Actually, if I can maybe stick with you on that point, because one of the questions that's come in here is about a tangible example of how data is used as part of decision making. Are there any examples that people can give on that data point?
We had one earlier with Gamal, who asked the question about how many of us know how many women are in our business today, how many will be in the business tomorrow. Perfect example. Because then if you have any gaps there or hotspots, you've already identified that there's a root cause here. Well, you have to identify why there are those challenges and then put those appropriate interventions in place.
So, sorry.
So go on. No, and just to add on that, it's also laying on that intersectional lens, so you can have data. So, for example, coming back to the gender pay gap, if you're looking at, say, women as a homogenous group, but then you think ethnicity, age, and you start to go deeper in the data, then you're really able to isolate what are the things, the levers we need to pull.
So, two things. The first one is there's a brilliant campaign called White Ribbon Campaign. Anybody heard of it? White Ribbon. And it started in Canada, but it came over here a few years ago, and more organisations are starting to sign up to the White Ribbon Campaign. And it's all focused on protecting women at work. And that's a brilliant campaign that more organisations can start looking at. But the other thing, it comes back to what questions are we asking in our surveys? And again, I personally believe we need a radical change of what we ask in our staff surveys, in our pulse surveys, and any other surveys that we need to do. And again, reflecting some of the updated issues and challenges that we're facing.
Amazing, thank you. I'm going to take another. I've got my back to this side of the room, so I'm not going to ask all the questions over here. So while the microphone is going to the lady right at the back, over this side, I'm going to ask a question that's come in online. And Dan, this might be something, I know you sort of touched on this a little bit with your shadow board and recruitment, but experiences of auditing your recruitment process to remove barriers from underrepresented talent. Is there anything
I suppose that example I gave before is when you look at the distribution of across various different characteristics, you've really got to interrogate, and I think if you interrogate well with, as managers, why have I got to the outcome that I have, then you can really then start to understand the inputs. So if you write, university educated, you will get university educated people. You will, because that's what you get, and you tend to get what you incentivize as well. So look, I think for me, it's about a continuous improvement mentality, and this isn't particularly new thinking. Continuous improvement is normal for many organisations, but if you can, you shouldn't get to a point, and this is about, we talked about the parallels with health and safety before. You never stop trying to improve health and safety. Even if you get to zero, you still keep improving, and I think this is also true in inclusion, is that you've still got to continually find ways, even if you think you're doing a damn good job.
Amazing. Before I go to the lady at the back over here with the question in the room, maybe I think, Joanna, you raised the spectre of the brilliant jerk. A question in from online is, how do you actually move forward with career progression when your manager is the brilliant jerk?
Oh gosh, I feel like I'm in sort of say I don't comment on individual cases, but I think that's when allyship is really important, because absolutely, exactly. Because you need someone else in that room to call out that behaviour, and you can call it out both ways. You can call it out in the moment, or you can calling it in if you're familiar with those phrasing. But it's that somebody is picking, and if you don't feel that you are able to do that, that is very common, and and that's the reality, sadly, in many cases. But we haven't even really talked about psychological safety, but do you have allies that will sit there in the meeting when that happens? Someone says, I don't think that's appropriate, because that's when your culture's working. And that can be anybody of any level, but you have to have that safety to do it. Yeah. And if you are a senior leader and you see it, then in any way address it. Even if it's not in the moment, you can address it afterwards and say, that was not on.
Yeah, amazing, thank you. Okay, question in the room. Do you have a microphone?
Yes, I do.
Yes, amazing.
Hi, I'm Jess Taylor and I'm from Cornbury. Really interesting panel discussion, by the way, and I could tell you lots of stories about how the market is not the blocker for hiring women, and there are still lots of clients out there that do not deal with women maybe that come from slightly adjacent backgrounds, and that we really work to push into roles, but ultimately they are more comfortable hiring what they have hired before. But anyway, I could wax lyrical about that. My experience, and I've been in the industry for 25 years, is that to embed diversity and inclusion needs to start at the top from an investment perspective. So I'll give you an example. I work a lot with private equity firms that are ultimately backed by institutional capital. These are pension funds. This is our money that's going into infrastructure and renewables and power. We do not hear enough questions from institutional investors as to what is the diversity and the ESG requirements from their private equity businesses. And we do not hear enough questions from the private equity into the portfolio companies that we buy. So if you want to embed diversity and inclusion, it has to start with a lot of the money, because renewables, power is about profit now, and there is definitely people are being left behind in that. So my question is probably for Dan and some of the people that have that kind of investment thesis when they're going out to market to invest in supply chain is, when you're looking at new investments, do you ask questions around what is their diversity? Have they worked in order to do that as part of your process? I'm actually in the process of hiring your replacement, Dan. I'm currently working for our
My replacement?
Not currently. It was fun while it lasted.
Sorry, I'm currently in the process of hiring the new CEO for Renewable UK.
Oh, yeah.
Just to clarify.
There's your P45.
And I think there are loads of amazing women that we will shortlist for that role, and it has been an eye-opening experience to kind of work with a board, which I think is absolutely brilliant. But I do think systematic change definitely comes from the starting point of money and investment, because people think twice before they kind of discard that, or they greenwash things. So that was just my experience, and I'd love to know, are you going to do anything around that when you're looking at new investments, given how much money you're being given by the government to change things?
Brilliant, thank you. And that would be a particularly harsh way to find out. I
mean, it's already been memorable today, hasn't it?
It has. But I think there's a really important point there, isn't there, about the supply chain as well, and that sort of, all the way down.
Look, this is so important from the job that I'm doing now, but I think there's definitely truth in it flowing right the way through the industry and through the value chain. And there was a point a few years ago where ESG values were, we're really interested, we're really valued in those conversations. And all I can say is, look, I'm unwavering on this. Whatever's happening in the world at the moment, we are going to be totally outcome orientated in how we invest. It's not about, yes, we're a company, so we'll have to make a return, but that's not the motivation. The motivation is, how can we deliver decent jobs? There's questions and conversation about conditionality. Should we insist on, for example, trade union recognition and things like that? Well, we're asking ourselves those questions about how far we can go and be a good corporate citizen at the same time. And, the way I see it is we need to be constantly at the progressive end of what we can insist on as an investor. Sometimes we'll be a minority investor and it'll be hard to insist, but there will be other times where our role is really catalytic. And the fact that a government-owned entity invests in a project can be the thing that unlocks that institutional capital that you're referring to, which might be a little bit hesitant, but then it sees GB Energy come in, and therefore it's really important that we're asking the social questions, asking how we're driving ESG, how we're driving inclusion, decent work, ethical supply chains, eradicating modern slavery. All of these things have to run right the way through what I do. I can only tell you, in some respects, the job I've got now is in the energy industry. It's one of the most interesting. It's a huge amount of scrutiny and accountability that I am taking on, but I do it because I'm passionate about making a difference on these things. That's the reason that I am here. It's a privilege to do it, and we'll keep fighting on that basis.
Amazing, thank you. I'm going to take one last question in the room. I'm going to go to this side of the room. So the gentleman at the back, if we could get a microphone there. We're getting close to time. And while we do it, it's just one of the questions that we've had coming in, which is about authenticity and how we can encourage female leaders to succeed authentically instead of sort of fitting in or dimming their own light. Who would like to start with that?
That's a heavy load.
Joanna, is there anything you might want to... Sorry to put you on the spot.
No, I think it's chicken and egg, isn't it? Because the thing that really helps is when you have role models that do that and you see a different way and you see a different piece. And I think having those roles, I think telling those stories, sharing those stories, I think really, really help. And that different way of doing it, but it ultimately comes down to your culture. And what is the culture that you as the really senior leaders are helping to create and do that? But I think we all have a responsibility in this room, whatever gender we are, to enable that space for us to have that authenticity as well within our teams, above the conversations. And I think there's a proverb that says, if you think that you're small and have no impact, you've never been in a room with a mosquito. Right? And it's a proverb, but it's true. And we all have a role and a responsibility.
So be more mosquito.
Be more mosquito.
Brilliant.
Just to add to that, not with a mosquito, although I have been bitten by many. They seem to like my skin colour. Feedback. One of the most important things that we're not very good at. If we want to encourage more women to be more confident in their abilities, and every single one of you in here are highly competent. You may not be as confident as you need to be, but that confidence is built through feedback. And the more feedback you get from people, the better it makes us feel. I personally, I'm not female, but I know if somebody gives me, or if I get a LinkedIn sort of message saying thank you very much, I'm on a high instantly. but also I'm gaining more confidence. And I see feedback as almost being a battery pack that we all have on our backs. And the more feedback we get, the more good feedback we get, the fuller that battery pack gets, so that when we are challenged in some way or form, we've got that resilience pack on our back, and it helps us overcome lots of different challenges.
And actually, there was a question on imposter syndrome that unfortunately we haven't got time to get to, but it absolutely goes to that point as well. I'm very conscious we are sort of at time and we're keeping you from lunch, but we've got the very final question, so I'd ask if you could please keep your question brief and to the panellists' answers even briefer. Over to the back.
Hi, Alex from the Wolf Power Club podcast, full-time storyteller and former commercial director of a massive energy company. Two things seem to have stopped that help people into our industry. One, work experience on a mass scale, in that there's a few nice projects, but it seems to have stopped that we have thousands of children, and I don't know if it's HSE or insurance. And the second thing, when I started my grad days at Shell, part of your role as a graduate was to do the family staff Christmas party where children would come in. And although there's a few giggles, if you really want to get the passion in that 12-year-old, how does the board feel that we could bring those two things back into energy industry across the workforces?
Thank you. I mean, Dan, that was your point, isn't it, about the family-friendly policies as well? Is there anything you want to add on to that?
Yeah, I just look at it, and again, I'm not being critical. I had a brilliant career at Siemens, and I would recommend it as a company to anyone to work for. But in my 17 years there, I never once went to a do which involved anyone else from my family. Never once. And, I think that's a real shame. And, at our UK, we did that differently. We brought families together. We did it when I actually ran the division in Spain, which was a subsidiary. We did do, family barbecues and things like that. I think these types of things, matter. I think they really do matter, and it's hard. I think what you have to name is the fact that it's harder now, because we are, I'm the first to embrace hiring talent where it is, rather than saying you have to be able to come into the office and I trust you to do your job, whether you make the choices about when you come in. So I'm the first to make that, to embrace that sort of technical frontier of being able to work remotely. But equally, it does mean that people are all over the place. So it's harder, but it just means you've got to make more effort to make it happen, I would say.
Exactly. And also it's my personal bugbear is all the evening receptions. Everything's an evening reception. It's like, I'd quite like to see my daughter in the evenings. That would be nice. But I think now the danger is everything is now breakfast meetings as well. So you have both ends of the day. It's fantastic. And is there any final comments that any of the panellists would like to just leave the audience with before we wrap up for lunch?
Final comment. Do we really know our people? If you think about the 10 people who you work with, and list them in terms of how much time you spend with each of them. Think about the person at the very bottom and ask yourself why you spend less time with that individual.
Really interesting. Joanna?
I think, to build on all the points of the panellists, this is to use a cliche, this is not a final destination process. It takes time, it's continual improvement, and when you think you're there, something out, just keep at it. It's there, it's constant, and keep in mind all of the great outputs and benefits of this work when it gets tough.
Senda.
I'm going to leave with an opening question around AI. We haven't actually referenced it at all in this discussion. Will we be left behind, or will it be an advantage in the inclusion story?
Well, there's a good story in the report, in the Leadership Coalition report, about how RWE are using AI to support their diversity and inclusion initiatives. So that's good.
Amazing. For something to read over their lunch break.
Mine is a hopeful point around, look, all this, this narrative, the geopolitical narrative, and it's real and it's important, it matters, but to look at it through a different prism. During the first Trump presidency, 75% of all of the power plants that were built in America, new power plants, were zero carbon, all of them. He stood against it, he fought against it, but it couldn't stop. Even he couldn't stop the irrepressible drive of the energy transition. Now, it's a very different thing, and there's economics at play, and there are real impacts from what has been done there. But I would just say, you know, for me, the movement will remain strong and powerful if we remain united and keep making progress on on this mission. And then there will be a time when that is all over, and we will still be here.
Yeah. Before I thank the panel, just to let everyone know that it is now the lunch break and networking opportunity. As you will have seen from the delegate list, there is a huge amount of talent and network present here today, so please do make the most of that opportunity. I'd also ask everyone in the room and online to please come back at 1:45. There's a panel session all around achieving the 40% by 2030. So please join me in thanking the panel this morning.
Woo!